Her judge refused to hear the final request of a 9-year-old girl before sentencing her to death when she turned 18 years old. Years later, as they were about to activate the electric chair, she revealed a secret that left everyone terrified. The night was quiet, with the house filled with laughter and lively conversation. 9-year-old Elizabeth was sitting at the table next to her older sister, 14-year-old Margaret, while their mother, Sylvia, served the last slice of pizza. It was one of those rare moments when nothing seemed to go wrong. Sylvia shared funny stories from her childhood, while Margaret mimicked their teachers, drawing belly laughs from Elizabeth. The smell of freshly baked pizza still lingered in the air, and the warm yellow lights of the living room created a cozy, familiar atmosphere. However, Elizabeth had other plans to make the night even more exciting. With a mischievous smile, she left the table and returned with a small object in her hand, a mini firework she had been saving for months. "Look, Mom, I want to show this. It'll be fun," Elizabeth exclaimed, holding the device excitedly. Sylvia stopped laughing and frowned when she saw what her daughter was holding. "Elizabeth, don't even think about it. That's dangerous," she warned, quickly rising to take the object from her hand. Elizabeth pouted, trying to argue. "It's just a little firework, Mom. It won't do anything, I promise," she replied, but Sylvia was firm. "Fire is not a game, Elizabeth. This could burn everything down. Put it away now." Sylvia took the small device and placed it in a high cabinet, out of the girl's reach. Elizabeth crossed her arms, upset, and returned to the table without a word. Margaret, sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood. "Hey, how about a magic trick? No fire, I promise," she said, winking at Elizabeth, who smiled shyly. Gradually, the tension dissipated, and laughter filled the room once again. It was as if that brief moment of conflict had been nothing but a passing cloud on an almost perfect night. When they finished eating, Sylvia bid her daughters good night and took them to their room. Elizabeth and Margaret shared the same room, with beds separated by a small nightstand cluttered with books and sketch pads. Sylvia made sure they were both comfortable before turning off the light. "Sleep well, my girls." "I love you," she said, kissing each of their foreheads. Elizabeth smiled, feeling safe, while Margaret mumbled something about a dream she wanted to have that night. The house grew quiet, with only the sound of crickets outside. It took Elizabeth a little while to fall asleep. Her mind was still restless, thinking about the little firework her mother had taken away from her. "I just wanted to have a little fun," she thought, turning in her bed. The scent of pizza still lingered in the air, but suddenly a strange smell caught her attention. A slightly bitter odor began to creep into the room. Elizabeth wrinkled her nose and opened her eyes. It wasn't a common smell. It was smoke. She got up slowly, trying not to make a sound and wake Margaret. She walked to the window and looked outside. In the backyard, something small glowed in the dark, like a burning ember. Elizabeth squinted, trying to figure out what it was. It looked like a cigarette butt thrown among dry leaves near the fence. She leaned a little closer, pressing her hands against the glass. "Who would do that?" she murmured to herself, a chill running down her spine. Before she could do anything, Elizabeth saw the glow grow brighter. The flames began to grow, devouring the dry leaves with frightening speed. The fire seemed to come alive, advancing towards the house's wall. In a matter of seconds, the flames were already climbing, licking the wooden siding as if they were famished. The orange glow reflected in Elizabeth's eyes as she felt her heart race. "No, this can't be happening," she thought, her mind gripped by panic. The smell of smoke was now suffocating, filling the room with a mix of heat and despair. Elizabeth felt sweat run down her face as her eyes widened at the shadows of the flames that were beginning to invade the walls. She tried to move, but it seemed her feet were glued to the floor. Fear paralyzed her, as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Every crackle of the fire sounded like a warning, a countdown to the worst. Finally, with her heart pounding and her hands trembling, Elizabeth managed to take a step towards Margaret's bed. "I need to wake her up. I need to do something," she thought, forcing her body to move. When she reached her sister's bedside, Elizabeth shook Margaret forcefully, but Margaret mumbled something, still deep in sleep. "Margaret, wake up! There's a fire! It's in the house!" she shouted, her voice breaking with despair. Margaret opened her eyes slowly, blinking several times as she tried to understand what was happening. The orange glow of the flames was already illuminating the room, and the heat seemed to be rising with every second. When she finally realized what was going on, Margaret jumped out of bed, her face pale with shock. "Elizabeth, is this serious? What do we do?" she asked, but Elizabeth had no answers. All she knew was that they needed to get out of there, and fast. The two girls looked at each other for a moment, sharing the same dread, before running to the bedroom door. Smoke was now beginning to invade the room, making the air difficult to breathe. The vision that greeted them from outside the room was even worse. The hallway was partially engulfed by flames, with pieces of the ceiling beginning to collapse. The walls were blackened, covered in the soot that spread like a disease. The heat was almost unbearable, and the smoke made the girls' eyes water. Margaret held Elizabeth's hand tightly, trying to protect her, but the truth was that they were both equally terrified. "Mom!" Elizabeth cried, attempting to call out for Sylvia, but there was no response. All they could hear was the roar of the fire, like a living creature devouring the home that had once been filled with laughter and love. Elizabeth's scream echoed through the house, and Margaret, now fully awake, gripped her hand firmly. "Mom! We need to find Mum!" Elizabeth exclaimed as the heat from the fire began to suffocate them. They ran down the hallway, dodging falling pieces of wood from the walls. The roar of the flames was deafening, and each step seemed harder as the heat increased and the smoke made the air unbreathable. Margaret, with a courage that seemed greater than her age, led the way, pulling Elizabeth behind her. "Mom! Where are you?" she shouted. But the only answer was the sound of the fire consuming everything around them. Upon reaching Sylvia's room, the girls found her awake, her face covered in sweat and desperation etched in her eyes. "Girls! Thank God!" Sylvia cried, rushing to embrace them quickly before pulling them towards the door. "We don't have time, we need to get out now," she said, her voice steady despite the evident panic. Sylvia held Margaret's hand with an almost painful grip, while Margaret held Elizabeth, forming a chain that connected them. They advanced through the hallway, which now seemed like a maze of fire and debris. Each step was a challenge, with the floor beginning to give way beneath their feet and the air growing heavier. As they tried to reach the exit, a loud crack echoed through the hallway. Sylvia stopped abruptly, looking up, but there was no time to react. A massive piece of the ceiling collapsed between her and her daughters, raising a cloud of smoke and ash. The impact separated them, throwing Margaret and Elizabeth backwards while Sylvia was trapped on the other side, surrounded by flames. "Mom!" Elizabeth cried, trying to move forward, but Margaret held her back tightly. "No, Elizabeth!" "It's too dangerous," Margaret said, her voice trembling as she looked at her mother with tear-filled eyes. On the other side, Sylvia tried to push the debris away, but the fire was spreading too quickly. Sylvia locked eyes with her daughters, her expression of despair turning to determination. "You need to get out of here now," she shouted, gesturing for them to run towards the back exit. "We can't leave you here," Margaret yelled, tears now freely streaming down her face. Sylvia shook her head, trying to appear resolute. "You have to go. I'll find a way out, I promise," she said, though the flames surrounding her left little hope that it was possible. Elizabeth, sobbing, attempted to run towards her mother, but Margaret pulled her back forcefully. "She wants us to go, Elizabeth. We have to do what she says," Margaret said, her voice laden with pain. The girls began to run towards the kitchen, where they knew there was a door leading to the backyard. The fire seemed to pursue them, advancing at a terrifying speed. Elizabeth looked back several times, hoping to see her mother following them, but all she saw were the flames devouring the hallway. Margaret held her hand with such force that it seemed she wanted to transfer all her strength to her younger sister. "It's going to be okay, Elizabeth, it's going to be okay," Margaret repeated, as if trying to convince herself. When they finally reached the back door, Margaret pushed Elizabeth outside before following her. They stumbled onto the lawn, falling to their knees as they coughed violently, trying to catch their breath. The sight of the burning house was terrifying. The flames had now completely engulfed the structure, and loud cracks announced that more parts of the ceiling were collapsing. "Mom's going to get out." "She promised," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling as she stared fixedly at the door they had exited. Margaret hugged her sister, trying to shield her from the devastating sight. Then, a deafening sound cut through the air. The explosion was so powerful that it threw them backwards, covering them in dust and debris. The heat from the fire intensified, lighting up the night as if it were day. Elizabeth felt the impact on her chest and was momentarily dazed, her ears ringing as she tried to understand what had happened. Margaret, lying by her side, also struggled to get up, but the weight of what she had just witnessed seemed greater than anything physical. They both looked at the house, or what was left of it, and saw that the flames had swallowed everything. There was no sign of Sylvia. "What are we going to do now?" Elizabeth whispered, her words almost inaudible amidst the ringing in her ears and the sound of the still burning fire. Margaret didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the house, her teary eyes reflecting the glow of the flames. For the first time she seemed unsure of what to do. Elizabeth clung to her sister's arm, as if fearing she too would disappear. "Margaret?" she called, her voice full of fear. Margaret finally looked at her sister but couldn't say anything. The tears began to fall, and all she could do was pull Elizabeth into a tight embrace, trying to shield her from the reality they both knew they couldn't avoid. The sirens began to wail in the distance, announcing the arrival of the firefighters. The sound, although a relief, also brought a new wave of despair. "It's too late," thought Margaret, as she looked at the remains of the house that was once filled with life and love. She knew that when the firefighters arrived, there would be nothing they could do but extinguish the flames and count the damages. Elizabeth, still clinging to her sister, whispered, "Mom will come back, won't she?" Margaret pursed her lips, fighting back the tears that threatened to escape. "I don't know, Elizabeth, I don't know," she replied, her voice barely audible. As the sirens drew closer, Margaret looked at the orange glow on the horizon, feeling the weight of everything she had lost. But at that moment, she also knew she needed to be strong, not for herself, but for Elizabeth. "We'll get through this," she thought, trying to find strength amid the chaos. But before she could say something to comfort her sister, a dark thought took hold of her mind. What if we never find out what really happened? Margaret and Elizabeth were sitting on the sidewalk, with thin blankets placed over their shoulders, by the neighbors who had come out to help. Both were in shock, their eyes fixed on the smoldering remains of their home. Elizabeth was gripping Margaret's hand so tightly that her tiny nails dug into her sister's skin. Neither of them could speak, their minds stuck on the last sight they had of Sylvia, separated from them by the fire. The firefighters worked quickly to extinguish the flames, but when they finally succeeded, little more than ashes and charred walls remained. One of the firefighters, a man with a stern expression, approached the girls and knelt in front of them. "Are you all right? Any injuries?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. Margaret shook her head, unable to form words. Elizabeth, on the other hand, began to cry silently, unable to cope with what had just happened. "Our mother." "She was still inside," Margaret finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The firefighter nodded, his gaze showing the gravity of the situation. In the hours that followed, the girls were taken to a temporary shelter. There, police officers and investigators began to ask questions. Initially, the questions were gentle. "Where were you when the fire started? Did you see anything strange?" Elizabeth answered hesitantly, trying to explain what she had seen, the glow in the backyard and the smell of smoke. But when she mentioned the small fireworks she had tried to light that night, the investigator's expression changed. He exchanged glances with one of the officers and made quick notes in his notebook. "This firework, where was it before the fire started?" the man asked, his voice harsher now. Elizabeth looked at Margaret, confused and scared, before answering, "My mum kept it in the closet. I didn't use it, I swear." The following days brought a storm of uncertainty for the girls. News of the fire spread throughout the town, and soon the case was handed over to a team of forensic fire investigators. They combed through the debris of the house, analyzing every burnt piece for clues. When they found the remains of the small firework near what had been the closet, suspicions began to take shape. For the investigators, it seemed obvious. The fire had started there. And if Elizabeth had tried to light the device earlier that night, she immediately became the prime suspect. Margaret tried to protect her sister from all the insinuations that began to arise, but it was impossible to avoid the judgmental looks of the people around them. How could a 9-year-old girl do such a thing? She heard a neighbor comment, while another muttered, "Those children, sometimes they have no idea." Elizabeth, oblivious to most of what was said, began to realize that something was wrong when the police returned to interrogate her again. Elizabeth, we need you to be honest. Did you light that firework? An officer asked while Margaret sat beside her sister, squeezing her hand. Elizabeth shook her head vigorously. No, I didn't do anything. My mom kept it away from me, she replied, her voice trembling. Despite her denials, the accusation against Elizabeth began to gain strength. The preliminary investigation report pointed to the firework as the probable point of ignition for the fire. For the investigators, the fact that Elizabeth had mentioned the device before and her attempt to light it seemed like sufficient circumstantial evidence. When the case went to court, the atmosphere became even more tense. Elizabeth, small and vulnerable, sat beside Margaret as a prosecutor described the events with chilling coldness. The defendant, Elizabeth, was last seen handling a firework on the night of the fire. Despite being warned by her mother, she insisted on lighting it. This, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is not childish negligence. It's intent, the prosecutor declared, pointing at Elizabeth. The courtroom was silent, except for occasional murmurs from the audience. Margaret looked at her sister, seeing the terror in her eyes as she heard the accusations. "That's not true!" Margaret shouted, suddenly standing up. "She would never do something like that on purpose. It was an accident." The judge banged his gavel, ordering silence. Elizabeth began to cry, her tears silently rolling down as her defense attorney tried to argue that there was insufficient evidence to incriminate her. But the prosecutor's narrative was powerful. He painted a picture of a resentful girl who wasn't allowed to play with the firework, and then, in a moment of carelessness, caused the fire that took her own mother's life. The most devastating moment came when the prosecutor presented a surprise witness, a neighbor who claimed to have seen Elizabeth playing near the backyard that night. "I saw the little girl outside with something shining in her hands. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it seems obvious what happened," the woman said, her voice full of conviction. Margaret held Elizabeth's hand, trying to convey strength, but she knew things were getting harder and harder. Elizabeth looked at her sister, her eyes filled with fear. "I didn't do it, Margaret, I didn't do it," she whispered, but her voice was almost inaudible. The climax of the trial came when the judge allowed the prosecutor to make one final statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are talking about a tragedy that could have been avoided. A mother lost her life, and now it is up to us to ensure that justice is served. It doesn't matter the defendant's age. What matters is that she made a decision that cost someone's life. This cannot be ignored," he said, his voice echoing through the room. Elizabeth looked at the judge, her small figure seeming even smaller in that large courtroom. She wanted to speak, wanted to scream that she was innocent, but the words wouldn't come out. The room seemed to spin around her, and all she could hear was the sound of the prosecutor's voice and the silent stares of the jury. The last thing she saw before the judge adjourned the session was Margaret sitting beside her, her face full of tears and despair. Elizabeth knew the next day would bring her sentence, but the question echoing in her mind was, how did it all go so wrong? The courtroom was in complete silence, except for Elizabeth's soft sobs. The 9-year-old girl, small and fragile, stood before Judge Andrew, her eyes swollen from crying. She was trembling, both from fear and despair, as she clutched the hem of the dress Margaret had chosen for her to wear that day. "Please, Your Honor, I didn't do any of this," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking as tears streamed down her face. "I never wanted to hurt my mum. I loved her. It was an accident, I swear." The Judge Andrew, a middle-aged man with a severe and cold expression, looked down at her from the tribunal with disdain. To him, Elizabeth was a problematic child who had been responsible for a tragedy. He crossed his arms, listening to Elizabeth's pleas with apparent indifference. "The defendant has already had enough opportunity to defend herself. The evidence is clear and leaves no room for doubt," he said, his voice echoing through the room. Elizabeth looked at Margaret, who was sitting on the back bench, her eyes equally red from crying so much. "I don't know what to do, Margaret," Elizabeth whispered, almost inaudibly. Desperate, Margaret stood up from the bench. "Your Honor, this is an injustice. My sister is just a child. She would never do something like this on purpose," she shouted as 2 officers approached to restrain her. The judge banged his gavel forcefully, ordering silence in the courtroom. "If you continue to interrupt, you will be removed from the court," he said, staring at Margaret with a cold look. Margaret sat down again, but she kept her gaze fixed on Elizabeth, as if trying to convey strength through despair. Realizing that no one seemed to believe her, Elizabeth tried again. "Please, I just want to explain. There's something important I need to say," she said, her voice louder this time, but still trembling. The judge cut her off before she could continue. "I've heard enough. Your words don't change the facts presented. It's time to announce the sentence," he declared with a final tone. Elizabeth looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would help her, but no one said anything. Everyone seemed motionless, watching the girl's fate being sealed. The judge adjusted his glasses and picked up a paper from his desk. "Elizabeth, for the crimes committed, including the death of your mother as a result of your reckless actions, this court sentences you to the death penalty. The execution will be carried out when you turn 18, he announced, his voice firm and unwavering. The words seemed to freeze time in the room. Elizabeth's eyes widened, unable to comprehend what she had just heard. Margaret screamed in horror, trying to rush forward to embrace her sister, but was restrained by the officers who held her back. "This can't be true. She's just a child," Margaret screamed, struggling to break free. Elizabeth, on the other hand, remained completely motionless. Her body seemed to have been paralyzed by the weight of the sentence. Tears streamed uncontrollably, and her mind was blank, as if she couldn't process what it meant. The judge showed no reaction to the sister's emotional outbursts. He simply banged his gavel again. "The hearing is adjourned," he declared, rising from his chair as the officers began to lead Elizabeth out. "Please listen to me," Elizabeth shouted, finally finding the strength to speak. She tried to turn to the judge but was pulled forcefully by the guards accompanying her. "I have something important to say. You need to listen," she continued, now shouting, as the officers dragged her out of the room. The judge, however, didn't even look at her. He had already decided that the case was closed, and nothing Elizabeth said would change his mind. Margaret continued screaming, begging for someone to listen to her sister. "She's innocent. For God's sake, she's just a child," she cried, as the officers ushered her out of the room. Elizabeth, still being led away by the guards, turned her head to look at Margaret. "Margaret, I didn't do it, I promise," she said, as she was pushed through the door. Margaret tried to run after her, but was again barred by the police officers. The sight of her sister being taken away seemed like the last drop of hope fading away. As the courtroom door slammed shut, Elizabeth felt the weight of the sentence fall on her shoulders. No matter how much she had told the truth, no one believed her. All that was left was silence, fear, and the long wait for the years until the day of her execution. The courtroom was in absolute chaos. Everything seemed to have been resolved and the case was closed. Judge Andrews' final words, sentencing Elizabeth to the death penalty when she turned 18, echoed in everyone's minds. Elizabeth, still in shock, couldn't move a muscle. Her eyes, fixed on the floor, were filled with tears, silently streaming down her face. Margaret, on the other hand, was consumed by uncontrollable fury. She couldn't believe that her sister, a mere 9-year-old girl, had been condemned for something she knew Elizabeth couldn't have done. Margaret's words resonated in her mind. "This can't be real. They can't do this to her." Without a second thought, Margaret abruptly rose from her seat and ran towards Judge Andrew, who was still seated in his chair, organizing the papers of the sentence. "You're a liar. This is a sham. My sister is innocent," Margaret shouted as she jumped onto the courtroom desk, trying to reach him. The impact of her body against the wood sent papers flying, and the judge looked at her with an expression of complete disdain. "Guard!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. The guards moved quickly, grabbing Margaret by the arms and trying to pull her off the desk, but she fought like a lioness, kicking and screaming. "You know you're lying. This wasn't her fault. You're fabricating this to cover something up," she yelled as the guards pulled her forcefully. Elizabeth, watching the scene, finally snapped out of her stupor. "Margaret, no!" she screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the shouts and murmurs of the audience watching the scene in awe. The Judge Andrew, visibly irritated, adjusted his robe and banged the gavel forcefully, demanding silence in the courtroom. "Take that woman out of here immediately! I will not tolerate this kind of behavior in my courtroom," he ordered. Margaret continued to struggle, her voice hoarse from shouting. "You are killing a child! You are not human! You are a monster!" she screamed, as the guards finally dragged her out of the room. Elizabeth, seeing her sister being removed, tried to run to her, but was restrained by another guard. "Margaret, don't go. Please stay with me," she pleaded, but her voice was faint amidst the chaos. When the courtroom finally calmed down, Judge Andrew adjusted his glasses and looked at Elizabeth coldly. "It is evident that this girl cannot remain in the care of her sister, who clearly does not have the emotional stability necessary to deal with this situation," he said, with a tone of contempt. "From today, Elizabeth will be sent to an orphanage until her sentence is carried out. This court is adjourned," he concluded, banging the gavel once more before standing up. Elizabeth felt her world crumbling as if she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Everything she knew, everything that made her feel secure, was being brutally and irreversibly ripped away from her. First, she had lost her mother in the fire that consumed their home. Now she was being separated from the only person who still believed in her sister Margaret. Elizabeth's heart felt crushed, as if the air around her had vanished. The guards held her arms firmly, but she struggled, trying to break free. "Please, no, I want to stay with Margaret. She's my sister, she takes care of me," she cried, her voice charged with despair. Each word seemed like a futile plea, drowned in the indifference of the system that had already decided her fate. The guards did not hesitate. They dragged Elizabeth through the courthouse hallways, her small feet barely able to keep up with their long, purposeful strides. She looked back repeatedly, trying to see Margaret, but all she saw was the courtroom door closing behind her. That final sight drove a void into her chest that seemed impossible to fill. As she was led out, Elizabeth felt like she was just a doll being taken wherever they wanted, powerless against the injustice that was swallowing her. Her sobs echoed down the hallway, but no one seemed to hear, no one seemed to care. Outside, Margaret was in a desperate struggle. She tried to break free from the guards holding her arms, her voice hoarse from screaming. "You can't do this to her. She's just a child, she didn't do anything," she shouted, desperation etched into every word. But the guards showed no emotion. They held her firmly, pushing her away from the courthouse entrance, while Elizabeth was taken out through another exit. Finally exhausted, Margaret lost her strength and fell to her knees on the cold sidewalk. Her eyes were fixed on the closed door, as if she still expected her sister to come out of it. But only silence came. Tears streamed down Margaret's face, mixing with the dust on the ground. "I'll get you out of this, Elizabeth, I promise," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but charged with a determination that was the only thing left in her heart. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was placed in a police car, her hands still trembling with fear. The door closed with a sharp sound, and the vehicle began to move, leaving the courthouse behind. She looked out the window, the streets passing quickly, blurred by the tears filling her eyes. Margaret was no longer there to hold her hand, to tell her everything would be okay. For the first time, Elizabeth felt completely alone. She curled up on the back seat, hugging her legs, trying to hide herself from the world around her. The weight of being separated from Margaret was unbearable, as if a part of her soul had been ripped away. "Why doesn't anyone believe me?" she whispered to herself, her voice almost inaudible. Elizabeth's thoughts mingled with the sound of the car's engine. She tried to understand how everything had reached this point. A week ago, her life was filled with laughter and simple moments with her family. Now everything lay in ruins. The image of her mother, lost in the fire, still haunted her mind, and Margaret's face, screaming for her in the courtroom, seemed etched into her memories like an eternal scar. Elizabeth knew Margaret's promise was true, but deep down she felt the situation was bigger than anything her sister could solve. When the car finally stopped, Elizabeth looked out and saw the orphanage building. It was a grey, lifeless structure, with peeling walls and small windows that looked like sad eyes watching the world. She was pulled out of the car by the guards, her feet hesitant as they touched the ground. The iron gate creaked open, and the sound echoed in a frightening way. Elizabeth looked around, trying to find something that would bring her a bit of comfort, but everything in that place seemed cold and indifferent. "This will be your home for now," one of the guards said, his voice emotionless. Elizabeth wanted to scream that this was not a home, that she already had a home, but she knew no one would listen. As she entered the orphanage, the smell of mold and old food invaded her nostrils. The walls were covered in marks of time and neglect, and the children there seemed just as lost as she was. Some looked at Elizabeth with curiosity, while others simply ignored her arrival. Elizabeth felt even smaller than she already was, an insignificant presence in a place that seemed to have swallowed all hope. A tired-looking orphanage worker took Elizabeth's arm and led her to a small empty room. "You stay here," she said, pointing to a bed with thin sheets and a worn pillow. Elizabeth didn't respond. She just sat on the edge of the bed looking at the floor as the door closed behind her. In the solitude of that room, Elizabeth began to cry again. It was a silent cry, as if she no longer had the strength to scream. Each falling tear seemed to take a piece of her hope with it. She thought of Margaret, of the promise her sister had made, and tried to cling to it as the last rope keeping her above the abyss. But the weight of what had happened, the loss, the injustice, was crushing. Elizabeth lay down on the bed, hugging the pillow as if it were the only thing that still connected her to the world. As sleep finally claimed her, a single question echoed in her mind. Will she be able to save me? The years passed, and the orphanage became a place of nightmares for Elizabeth. Now at 13 years old, the girl had already learned that in that cold and negligent environment, she could count on no one but herself. From the first day, her story preceded her. The other children, knowing of the judgment and sentence, began to treat her as an aberration. "It's that girl who killed her own mother," they whispered in the hallways, but Elizabeth heard. The looks of disdain and stifled laughter followed her wherever she went, like shadows that never disappeared. The bullying began with small acts. In the cafeteria, the children would take Elizabeth's food before she could serve herself. At first, she complained to the caregivers, but they just shrugged, too busy or indifferent to her suffering. "Be strong, Elizabeth," she murmured to herself, as her stomach growled for the third consecutive night. But things started to get worse. The children began hiding her belongings, ripping the few clothes she had out of the closet, and throwing them into the mud in the courtyard. Elizabeth tried to ignore it, cleaned what she could, and moved on, but the emotional scars grew day by day. One afternoon, as Elizabeth sat in a corner of the courtyard trying to draw something in an old notebook she had found in the trash, 3 children approached her. "What are you drawing, murderer? A plan to kill someone else?" one of the boys asked with a cruel smile. Elizabeth didn't respond. She knew any reaction would only feed their cruelty, but that didn't stop them. One of the boys snatched the notebook from her hands and began tearing out the pages. "Look, now she doesn't even have a way to plan anymore," he said, laughing as he threw the pieces on the ground. Elizabeth clenched her fists, holding back tears. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The nights were the worst. While the other children slept in their beds, Elizabeth would often find her own mattress soaked with water or covered in food scraps. "It's so you'll remember what you did," one of the girls would whisper as the others laughed before walking away. Elizabeth tried to clean the mattress as best she could, but the cold of the night made her shiver. She huddled in a corner of the room, hugging her knees, trying to imagine a world where everything was different. "Margaret," she whispered to herself like a mantra. The memory of her sister was the only thing keeping her standing, the only hope that someone, somewhere, still cared about her. Hunger became a constant punishment. Whenever Elizabeth tried to serve herself in the cafeteria, the children would push her out of the line. "You don't deserve to eat," they'd say as they emptied the plates in front of her. The caregivers, who barely cared about the children, completely ignored the situation. Some days, Elizabeth had to rummage through the orphanage's trash in search of food scraps. Even then, whenever she found something, she had to eat in hiding, fearing that someone would see her and ridicule her even more. Her body began to show signs of deprivation. Elizabeth was thinner than ever, her bones protruding under her pale skin, and her strength dwindling by the day. One night, after another day of humiliation and hunger, Elizabeth sat on the floor of the room, hugging her legs. The moon dimly illuminated the small space, and she looked out the window, trying to imagine the world outside. "Does Margaret still think of me?" she asked herself, as tears silently streamed down her face. She had no answers, only the silence of the orphanage as company. All she wanted was to escape, to leave this place and all the painful memories behind. But the sentence looming over her head was a constant reminder that her freedom was an illusion. At 18, the time she had left would be over. Yet even in the midst of despair, there was a spark within Elizabeth that refused to go out. "They won't break me," she thought, clenching her fists. Even though she was treated like a monster, She knew in her heart that she wasn't guilty of the fire. This truth was the only thing keeping her fighting, even when everything around her seemed to try to crush her. In the silence of that night, Elizabeth made a promise to herself. I will survive no matter what happens. I will prove my innocence. And with that determination, she fell asleep, dreaming of the day she could finally leave behind the nightmare she called life. Meanwhile, Margaret woke up every day with the same feeling, a growing emptiness in her chest that seemed to deepen with each dawn. Years had passed since the last time she saw Elizabeth, but the image of her sister being dragged out of the courtroom, crying and screaming her name, was still as clear as on that fateful day. Now at 18, Margaret had become a determined young woman, but one marked by loss. She worked at a small convenience store where she spent long hours stocking shelves and serving customers who rarely noticed her existence. The pay was low, but she saved every penny with a single goal: to find a way to help Elizabeth. Despite the difficulties of work, Margaret's thoughts were always with her sister. Is she okay? Does she still think of me? She constantly asked herself. The longing was a weight she carried every day, a burden she couldn't leave behind. As she arranged the stock boxes or wiped down the store counter, her mind wandered, remembering Elizabeth's laughter, how she held her hand through the tough times. Those were simple days but full of love, and the memory of them was the only thing keeping her steady. On weekends, when she was off, Margaret walked the streets near the courthouse where Elizabeth's fate had been decided. She always had the hope of finding some clue, of seeing something that could help her change the course of events. It was on one of those walks that she began to notice something curious. Judge Andrew, the same man who had convicted Elizabeth, often passed by there. He always seemed rushed, carrying a briefcase or talking on the phone, with the same serious and cold expression Margaret remembered from the trial. The sight of the judge made her blood boil. He lived his life as if nothing had happened, while Elizabeth paid for a crime she did not commit. How does he sleep at night? Margaret thought, watching him from afar. Several times she considered confronting him right there, but always hesitated. She knew she would need more than words to challenge him. One day he'll pay for what he did, she promised herself as she returned home with the weight of anger growing in her heart. One day, after a long day at work, Margaret decided she needed to see Elizabeth. It had been years since they last met, and the longing was almost unbearable. She had saved some money and bought a small box of cookies, the only gift she could afford. I hope this makes her smile, she thought, holding the box carefully as she took the bus to the orphanage where Elizabeth was. The journey was long, but her determination made her ignore the weariness. When she arrived at the orphanage gate, she was greeted by a woman with a stern expression, who seemed immediately bothered by her presence. How can I help you? The woman asked, crossing her arms and looking Margaret up and down. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I came to visit my sister, Elizabeth. It's been years since I last saw her, and I'd like to know how she's doing, she explained, her voice laden with emotion. But the woman merely raised her eyebrows, as if Margaret's words were a nuisance. I'm sorry, but visits are not allowed without prior scheduling, and even then, only with authorization, she replied coldly. Margaret felt her heart sink. Please, ma'am, I'm the only family she has. I just want to see her for a few minutes. She must be waiting for me, she pleaded, her voice choked. But the woman shook her head, unshakable. The rules are clear. No authorization, no visit. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do, the woman said, before turning her back and entering the building, slamming the gate shut. Margaret stood there, unsure of what to do. The box of cookies in her hands seemed ridiculously small in the face of her powerlessness. Tears started streaming down Margaret's face, but she quickly wiped them away. She looked at the gate, hoping that somehow Elizabeth would appear on the other side, but all she saw was the grey, lifeless building. I just wanted to see you, she murmured, holding the cookies against her chest. With heavy shoulders, she began walking back to the bus stop, each step more difficult than the last. The silence around her seemed to mock her pain. As she waited for the bus, Margaret looked at the box of cookies and felt a new wave of frustration. They don't want me to see her. Why? What are they hiding? She asked herself, as her mind began to fill with suspicions. The image of Judge Andrew came back to her, always walking the streets as if he were untouchable. What if he knows something? What if he's involved in a way I didn't realize? She thought, gripping the cookies tighter. When she got home, Margaret put the cookies on the table and collapsed into a chair. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, the longing for Elizabeth was almost unbearable. On the other hand, the anger at the judge and the entire system that had convicted her sister without concrete evidence consumed her from within. That night, as she stared at the ceiling of her small room, Margaret made a decision. "I'll find out the truth, and I'll make them all pay for what they did to her," she promised, her eyes shining with determination. From that moment on, her life would no longer be just about surviving. It would be about fighting. Fighting for Elizabeth, for justice, and for the bond that time and injustice could never destroy. The night at the orphanage was quiet, but Elizabeth couldn't sleep. The whispers of the other children had reached her ears earlier. "Your sister came here today." At that moment, her heart raced. Margaret was here. She tried to see me, she thought, feeling a mixture of joy and pain. Elizabeth knew she shouldn't cling to hope, but just knowing that Margaret still thought of her warmed her chest, even if only for an instant. As the other children slept, Elizabeth sat on the edge of her bed looking out the window that faced the courtyard. She knew the doors were locked, but her desire to see Margaret was greater than any obstacle. "I need to find her. I can't wait anymore," she whispered to herself, her eyes fixed on the window. Since being brought to the orphanage years ago, Elizabeth had dreamed of the day she would reunite with her sister, and now she knew Margaret was trying to do the same. This was her chance. Elizabeth began to trace a plan. She knew the caregivers' shifts well and knew that at that time only one of them made the rounds, always distracted by a book or dozing off in the reception chair. Silently, she pulled the sheets from her bed and tied them, creating an improvised rope. Her heart was beating fast as she tied firm knots, her breathing short with adrenaline. "I just need to get through the courtyard. After that, I'll be out," she thought, trying to calm the nervousness growing inside her. When everything was ready, Elizabeth carefully opened the window, making sure not to make any noise. The cold night air hit her immediately, but she didn't hesitate. She threw the sheets over the windowsill and started to descend. Her small hands gripped the fabric tightly, the fear of falling fighting against the will to continue. When her feet finally touched the courtyard ground, she let out a sigh of relief. Halfway there, she thought, looking around to make sure no one was nearby. Elizabeth ran across the courtyard, dodging the shadows and keeping away from the lights that were still on. Her bare feet barely made a sound as they touched the cold ground. When she reached the iron gate that separated the orphanage from the outside world, she felt her heart tighten. The gate was locked, as always, but Elizabeth knew how to get through it. For months she had noticed a small hole at the bottom of the grate, hidden by bushes. It was tight, but she could squeeze through. Crouching down, Elizabeth crawled through the hole, scratching her arms and knees, but finally emerging on the other side. Out there, the world seemed enormous and scary, but also full of possibilities. Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling freedom for the first time in years. She didn't know exactly where Margaret was, but she remembered the store where she worked. It was her only destination, and nothing would make her stop until she got there. The girl began walking down the deserted streets, her bare feet echoing on the cold asphalt. The fear of being caught was ever present, but the hope of seeing Margaret was stronger. After an hour of walking, Elizabeth spotted the small convenience store where Margaret worked. The lights were off, but she knew her sister lived in the back. "Margaret!" she shouted, pounding on the door with all her might. For a few seconds, everything went silent, and Elizabeth felt panic rising. "What if she's not here? What if I never find her?" she thought, but then she heard hurried footsteps on the other side of the door. When the door opened, Margaret was there, her eyes wide with surprise. "Elizabeth!" said Margaret, her voice a disbelieving whisper. Elizabeth could barely respond before being pulled into a tight hug. "I knew you would try to see me." "They told me you were at the orphanage," said Elizabeth, her voice trembling. Margaret began to cry, holding her sister tightly. "I tried, but they wouldn't let me see you. I'm so sorry, Elizabeth." "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with guilt. The two stayed embraced for minutes, unwilling to let go of each other, as if the world could separate them again at any moment. When they finally pulled away, Margaret took Elizabeth's hand and led her inside, sitting her down on the small couch. "You're so thin. They're not taking care of you, are they?" she asked, her voice now full of anger. Elizabeth just shook her head, looking down. "They don't care about me. Nobody cares," she replied, with a sadness that broke Margaret's heart. Margaret prepared a simple snack for Elizabeth, using the little she had in the kitchen. As her sister ate, Margaret sat beside her, holding her hand. "I'll figure it out, Elizabeth. I'll get you out of there, even if it costs me everything I have," she promised, her eyes filled with determination. Elizabeth wanted to believe, but deep down, she felt their fate was crueler than that. The moment was interrupted by a loud knock on the door. Elizabeth froze, her eyes widening with fear. "It's the police," she whispered, gripping Margaret's arm tightly. Margaret opened the door carefully, and 2 officers were there with stern expressions. "We received an alert from the orphanage about a runaway. We're here to take the girl back," one of them said, ignoring Margaret's protests. Elizabeth started crying, clinging to her sister. "Please don't take me. I just want to stay with her," she pleaded, but the officers forcibly pulled her away. Margaret tried to stop them, but was pushed aside by one of the officers. "She's my sister. You can't do this," she shouted as Elizabeth was placed in the car. Through the window, Elizabeth looked at Margaret, her eyes filled with tears and despair. "I love you, Margaret," she cried as the car started to pull away. Margaret stood there on the sidewalk, feeling powerless. All she could do was watch as Elizabeth was taken back to the nightmare she had tried to escape. The years passed, and the injustice that had separated Elizabeth and Margaret became the center of both their lives. Elizabeth, now 17, remained trapped in the orphanage but had hardened over time. The humiliations and deprivations no longer broke her like they once did, though the scars ran deep. Her appearance had changed. Her eyes, once filled with curiosity and innocence, now reflected the hardness of a life filled with loss and suffering. Despite this, she continued to cling to one promise. Margaret was still out there, and someday, somehow, her sister would come for her. Meanwhile, Margaret, now an adult, carried the guilt and pain of not having been able to save Elizabeth. Every night, when she closed her eyes, she saw her sister being taken away by the police, screaming her name. The image haunted her dreams, and her hatred for Judge Andrew grew with each passing day. Margaret was no longer the naive young woman who believed in the system. She knew she had to act, and her heart was consumed by a single mission: to destroy the man who had condemned her sister and ruined their lives. Margaret began hatching a plan. She spent weeks observing Judge Andrew's movements, noting his schedules and routine details. She knew he lived in a large house in a secluded neighborhood, surrounded by high walls and imposing gates. Still, she noticed gaps: the time when the night guard made his rounds and the lights that went out promptly at 10 o'clock. Every detail was meticulously recorded. "I need to find something on him. Something that can expose him, destroy his reputation," Margaret thought, as she studied a makeshift map she had drawn of the property. That night, the tension in Margaret was palpable. Her plan was ready. She had decided to break into the judge's house. Margaret believed that inside that place she could find documents or evidence proving that he had manipulated Elizabeth's trial. Even if it was risky, she was willing to pay the price. "No matter what happens, he will pay for everything he did," she muttered, as she put on a backpack with basic tools she might need: a flashlight, gloves, and a small iron bar to force windows or doors. Margaret waited until the city was quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after midnight. Dressed in dark clothes and fierce determination, she walked through the streets towards the judge's house. Her steps were firm, but her heart was racing. When she arrived, she observed the place for a few minutes, making sure everything was as she had anticipated. The main gate was locked, but she knew there was a side entrance with less surveillance. Using the iron bar, she managed to open a small entrance and passed onto the property. The garden was large and dimly lit, with shadows that seemed to move at the slightest breath of wind. Margaret walked carefully, trying not to make noise. The cold of the night made her fingers tremble, but she didn't stop. Each step brought her closer to her goal, the judge's office, which was located at the back of the house, according to her observations. Margaret was so focused that she almost didn't notice a slight sound behind her, like the rustling of leaves. She stopped, frozen, and looked around. There was nothing. Just the wind, she thought, trying to calm her racing heart. When she reached the office window, she began working on the lock with her tools. The window was old and the latch gave way faster than she expected. Margaret opened the window, and was about to enter when she heard a clear and distinct sound behind her. Footsteps. Her body tensed, and she turned around quickly. In the darkness, she could make out the silhouette of someone approaching. A man with dirty clothes and a look that seemed both curious and tired. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Margaret backed away, her heart racing. The man looked like a beggar, with unkempt beard and a crumpled hat covering part of his face. She didn't know if he was a threat or just a curious onlooker, but his presence there was unexpected and dangerous. "It's none of your business," Margaret replied, trying to stay calm. The man tilted his head as if evaluating her. "Could you give me something to eat? It's been a long time since I ate anything." Margaret was paralyzed for a moment, her eyes fixed on the man before her. His request was simple but unexpected. "Something to eat," she repeated, almost as if she didn't believe the situation. She was there on the verge of breaking into the judge's house, carrying enough anger to face anything. But the hunger in that man's eyes made her hesitate. He didn't seem threatening, just tired, like someone carrying his own silent battles. "I don't have anything now," Margaret replied, trying to stay focused on her mission. However, as she looked at the beggar again, something in his expression struck her. He wasn't there to judge her or stop her, but seemed like a reminder of everything she had lost and the kind of person she wanted to be. "Wait here," she finally said, leaving her backpack on the ground and walking towards the street. She found a small diner open on the corner, where she used her last coins to buy a simple sandwich. As she waited, her mind was divided. Part of her wanted to return to the judge's house, finish what she had started, but another part felt that it wouldn't lead her anywhere. When she returned to the beggar, she handed him the sandwich with a look that mixed weariness and compassion. "Here, it's all I have now," she said, as the man accepted the snack with a tired but sincere smile. "Thank you, miss," he said, sitting down on the ground to eat. Margaret watched him for a moment, feeling the weight of her own actions. She knew she needed answers about the judge, but she didn't want her quest for justice to turn her into someone cruel or indifferent to the suffering of others. "Maybe this can wait," she thought, picking up her backpack from the ground. She looked at the beggar one last time before leaving. "Good luck," she said softly, and began to walk back home. The night air seemed lighter now, though the battle within her was far from over. At the orphanage, the night remained quiet, except for the occasional sound of footsteps in the hallway. Elizabeth, now 17 years old, lay in her bed, but sleep refused to come. The memories of the daily humiliations she faced made the nights difficult. Despite everything, Elizabeth kept a kindness in her heart that no one seemed to notice. She knew what it was like to be hungry, to feel isolated and despised, and that made her sensitive to the suffering of others, even those who mistreated her. That night, Elizabeth heard a soft cry coming from a corner of the room, a sound as unexpected as it was familiar. It was one of the girls who frequently teased her, the leader of the group that made sure to turn each of Elizabeth's days into a little hell. Elizabeth got up silently, moved by a curiosity mixed with something deeper, a compassion that insisted on surviving, even after everything she had endured. She walked carefully to the corner where the girl was huddled, trying not to startle her. "What's wrong?" Elizabeth asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper. The other girl, surprised, raised her gaze with red and swollen eyes from crying so much. Her usual hostility seemed to have vanished, replaced by a vulnerability that Elizabeth had never seen before. "I'm hungry. I haven't eaten anything all day," the girl replied, trying to hide her face between her arms as if her confession was something shameful. Elizabeth stood still for a moment, observing her. The scene was strange to her. This same girl had hidden her food so many times, laughed at her pain, and even encouraged others to do the same. And now, there she was, unprotected and asking for help. For an instant, Elizabeth thought about turning her back. Part of her believed it would be fair to leave her there, feeling the same emptiness she herself had faced so many times. But as she looked at the crouched girl, she remembered how terrible it was to be hungry, to feel an empty stomach and the sense of abandonment that came with it. She sighed, lowering her shoulders, as if carrying the weight of a decision. "Wait here," she said with an unexpected calm. Without waiting for a reply, she left the room and went to the kitchen. The kitchen was cold and dark, with the smell of dinner food still permeating the air. Elizabeth carefully opened the cabinets, trying not to make noise, and found a piece of bread and some cold soup that had been left behind. She put it all on a plate and held it firmly as she returned to the room. Her bare feet touched the cold floor, and each step seemed a reaffirmation that she was doing the right thing, even though it wasn't easy. "It's not much, but it's what I could get," Elizabeth said, extending the plate to the girl. The other looked at her with an expression of genuine surprise, as if she couldn't believe that Elizabeth, of all people, was offering help. "Why are you helping me?" I've always been horrible to you," the girl said, her voice hesitant, almost a whisper. Elizabeth shrugged, sitting beside her. "Because I know what it's like to feel hungry, and no one deserves that, even if they've treated me badly," she replied with a small smile. The girl took the plate, still incredulous, and began to eat slowly. The silence between them was heavy, but not with tension, as usual. This time it seemed a silence of understanding, as if something invisible was changing between them. Elizabeth watched as the girl devoured the bread and soup, noticing how her eyes, once so full of arrogance, now showed something closer to shame. "Thank you," the girl muttered in a low voice, almost as if she were afraid someone would hear her. Elizabeth just nodded, saying nothing. When the girl finished eating, she left the plate on the floor and looked at Elizabeth with an expression that mixed regret and admiration. "I thought you were bad. That it was all they said about you," she said, looking at the ground as she nervously played with her hands. Elizabeth, with her usual calmness, replied, "People say what they want, but that doesn't mean it's true." Her voice was serene, almost as if she were teaching something she had learned long ago. The girl smiled slightly, a shy but genuine smile, as if that moment had broken an invisible barrier. The two sat in silence for a few more minutes, without needing to say anything else. Elizabeth realized there was something powerful in that simple gesture, something no words could express. When the girl finally got up to return to bed, she looked at Elizabeth one last time and said, "Thank you, really." Elizabeth just smiled, watching as she walked away and lay down. It was the first time in years that Elizabeth felt that her kindness, so often ignored or ridiculed, had made a difference. That night, as she lay in her own bed, Elizabeth felt a strange but comforting sensation. Even in the midst of everything she faced, hunger, bullying, loneliness, she knew there was still kindness in her heart, and that was something no one could take away from her. As she looked at the ceiling of the room, she thought of Margaret and the silent promise that connected them. One day, all this will be over, she thought, closing her eyes and imagining the day she would finally be free by her sister's side. As Elizabeth fell asleep, the girl who had received her help was also awake, reflecting on what had happened. For the first time, she felt ashamed of all the cruel things she had done to Elizabeth. Maybe she's not the monster everyone says, she thought, as sleep slowly overcame her. At that moment, something had changed, not only between them, but within each of them. And without realizing it, a thread of hope had been planted in their hearts. The night was cold and silent when Margaret finally decided it was time to act. The decision to break into the judge's house came not only from her pent-up anger over the years, but also from her need to understand what had really happened. She wanted justice, but also answers. How could a man who seemed so self-assured, so relentless in his judgment, walk the streets without showing any guilt? There was something he was hiding, and Margaret was determined to find out. Dressed in dark clothes and with a light backpack on her back, she approached Judge Andrews' house. The property was large and surrounded by high walls, but she had already studied the place in detail. She knew that one of the ground floor side windows was usually left open, and that the security system had a floor on the left side of the gate. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "It's now or never," she muttered as she began to climb the fence. When she reached the other side, she kept crouched, walking carefully through the dimly lit garden. The light in the main room was still on, and Margaret could hear voices coming from inside the house. She approached a window and peeked through the curtains. What she saw left her disconcerted. Andrew was sitting at the dining table with a woman and two teenagers, all of them smiling. The family seemed to be in a moment of celebration. In the center of the table, there was a cake with a small candle, and Margaret could hear one of the children saying, "Congratulations on 8 years smoke-free, Dad." The scene seemed completely incompatible with the image of the cold and stern man she knew from the courtroom. Margaret felt her stomach churn. How could this man, who had destroyed her family, live such a peaceful and happy life? Her anger grew with every second she watched the family laughing and exchanging hugs, as if nothing in the world could touch them. She clenched her fists, but kept her focus. This doesn't change anything. He's still guilty, she thought, moving away from the window and heading towards the side of the house. Finally, she found the window she had planned to use to enter. As expected, the latch gave way easily, and Margaret slid inside the house, her feet touching the soft floor of the office. She illuminated the room with a small flashlight, moving carefully not to make a sound. The office was filled with books, awards, and framed certificates, all displaying the judge's prestige. Margaret ignored all of that, focusing on her mission. She began opening drawers, searching for anything that could reveal something about Andrew's past or Elizabeth's trial. However, in one of the back drawers, Margaret found something completely unexpected. It was a small wooden box locked with a simple latch. With a utility knife she had brought, she managed to open the box, revealing a stack of old letters. The paper was yellowed, but the words were still legible. Each letter began with the same name, Dear Sylvia. Margaret felt her heart stop for a moment. Sylvia was her mother's name. She picked up one of the letters and began to read, her hands trembling. Dear Sylvia, every day without you is like a wound that never heals. I think of you every moment, and even knowing that our love is impossible, I cannot stop loving you. Please know that everything I do is for you. The words were passionate, full of emotion, and left Margaret completely confused. My mother and the judge. This doesn't make sense, she thought, as she picked up another letter. All the letters were addressed to Sylvia, each one more intense than the previous one. Some mentioned secret meetings, while others spoke of the fear of being discovered. Margaret felt her legs weaken. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the letters, as she tried to process what she was reading. Her mother, the woman who had always taught her to fight for what was right, had had a relationship with the man who destroyed their lives. Margaret looked up, still in shock, and realized there was more in the box. There was also a small, slightly faded photograph, but clear enough for her to recognize the faces. It was Sylvia, much younger, standing next to Andrew. Both were smiling, as if the whole world was perfect. Margaret felt a mixture of anger and sadness as she looked at the photo. How is this possible? He loved my mother, she whispered to herself, clutching the photograph in her hands. The sound of footsteps upstairs brought her back to reality. She quickly put the letters in her backpack and turned off the flashlight. Her heart was pounding, and her mind was still full of questions. Who was Andrew really? What was his relationship with her mother? And more importantly, what did this mean for her and Elizabeth? Margaret knew the answers were there, but time was short. Carefully, she went back to the window she had entered from and escaped before anyone could notice her presence. When she got outside, Margaret ran away, with the letters and photograph tucked in her backpack. Her hands were shaking as she tried to understand what she had discovered. Why would a man who seemed to have loved Sylvia so much condemn her daughter to the death penalty? I need to find out the truth, she muttered, as she ran through the darkness. The image from the photo still burned in her mind, and Margaret knew her search for answers was just beginning. The next morning, Margaret woke with a crushing weight on her chest. The sun was already illuminating the sky, but for her, the day seemed shrouded in darkness. It was Elizabeth's birthday. Her sister was turning 18, but instead of celebrations, that day carried a terrible threat: the electric chair execution. Margaret felt despair take over her body as she sat at the small kitchen table. The letters and the photograph of her mother with Judge Andrew were scattered in front of her, like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't put together. She stared at the image, the smiling faces of her mother and the judge seeming to mock her. If he loved her so much, why did he condemn Elizabeth? Why did he destroy our lives, as she muttered, pressing her temples with her hands? The questions swirled in her mind like a whirlwind. Something didn't make sense, but Margaret knew she was close to discovering the truth. The letters revealed more than just a forbidden romance. There was something bigger, something Andrew was hiding. I need to find out what happened in that fire, she thought, her mind now focused on a single goal. As she looked out the window, trying to organize her thoughts, something caught her attention. Across the street, the neighbor's house remained the same as she remembered it from years ago. He was a reserved man, but Margaret knew he had kept security cameras on his property for a long time. What if he still has the recordings? She thought, feeling a glimmer of hope. Perhaps just maybe those cameras had recorded something from the day of the fire, something that could shed light on what really happened. Margaret grabbed her backpack where she kept the letters and hurried out of the house. The morning air was cold, the kind of cold that cut through the skin and seemed to reflect the gravity of the moment. She pulled her coat tighter around her body, but the chill wasn't the only reason for her shivering. Anxiety pulsed through her veins, each step laden with thoughts and possibilities she couldn't ignore. The streets were quiet, with few cars passing by, and the city seemed immersed in a deceptive calm, contrasting with the turmoil happening inside her. Her eyes fixed on the ground, but her mind was far away. What if I'm wrong? What if none of this works? She thought, but kept walking, each step a small act of courage. When she reached the neighbor's house, she stopped in front of the door, her hands sweaty and her heart racing. What if he doesn't let me see? What if it's too late? She thought, biting her lower lip. Margaret knew she was putting her last hopes on that request, and the fear of being rejected almost made her turn back. But then she closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The letters in her backpack seemed to weigh more than usual, as if they were a tangible reminder of her mission. I can't give up now. Elizabeth can't pay for something she didn't do, she muttered to herself, shaking her head as if to dispel the doubts. With a quick motion, she knocked on the door. The wood creaked slightly as the door opened, revealing a middle-aged man with graying hair and a face that displayed the accumulated weariness of years of work and worries. His eyes showed kindness, but also curiosity at seeing Margaret there so early. He frowned slightly, as if trying to decipher the reason for the unexpected visit. "Margaret, what are you doing here so early?" he asked, crossing his arms in a gesture of mixed surprise and prudence. His voice had a friendly tone but carried a hint of suspicion. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill her lungs as she gathered courage to respond. "Mr. Richard, I know this is strange, but I need your help. It's about my sister Elizabeth," she began, her voice trembling and low, almost hesitant. The words came out harder than she had imagined, but she knew she couldn't back down now. The man tilted his head, visibly confused. He knew about Elizabeth's case, as all neighbors did, but he didn't understand what Margaret expected from him. "Elizabeth? The girl from the fire? What could I do for her now?" he asked, trying to understand the gravity of the situation. Margaret took a step forward, her eyes fixed on his, trying to convey the urgency of her request. She knew she had no time to waste, but she also needed to choose her words carefully. "I know you've had cameras here for years. I need to know if you still have the recordings from the day of the fire 8 years ago," she said, her voice laden with determination. She barely noticed that she was clenching the straps of her backpack tightly, as if that would help her maintain control. The man widened his eyes, visibly surprised by the request. He blinked a few times, trying to process what he had just heard. "The cameras? Margaret, it's been so long. Why do you want to see that now?" he asked, his tone a mix of incredulity and caution. He didn't know what she expected to find in something so distant in time, but the seriousness on her expression made him reconsider. Margaret, for her part, did not hesitate, her voice firmer than ever before. "Because I think the truth is there, and this may be the only chance to save my sister," she replied, feeling the urgency of her mission grow. Every word seemed to come laden with a force that came from years of frustration and repressed hope. She took another step closer, the backpack swinging slightly on her back, and looked directly into Richard's eyes. Her gaze was full of something he couldn't ignore, a mixture of desperation and determination. "Can I check the cameras from the day of the fire?" she asked again, her voice now a whisper, but every word carried the weight of what was at stake. It was a simple request, but fraught with implications that only Margaret could understand at that moment. Richard hesitated for a moment, analyzing Margaret as if trying to decide whether or not to grant her request. There was something in her gaze that made him give in, a mixture of despair and determination that he couldn't ignore. "Okay, Margaret, let's try," he said finally, opening the door for her to enter. Relief washed over Margaret's body like a wave, but she knew there was still a long way to go. "Thank you, Mr. Richard." "Thank you so much," she replied, trying to contain the emotion in her voice. They walked to Richard's office, a small but organized space with a desk full of papers and an old computer in the center. He pulled the chair for Margaret and sat next to her, turning on the monitor. "If I still have those recordings, they'll be on the external drive. But Margaret, we're talking about almost a decade ago. I don't know if the files will be there," he warned as he connected the device to the computer. Margaret nodded, clasping her hands in her lap. "I need to try. I just need to see it with my own eyes," she replied, her voice trembling but firm. The computer took a while to load the files, the sound of the hard drive working filling the tense silence of the room. When the list of recordings finally appeared, Richard began scrolling through the dates, each click of the mouse seeming an eternity for Margaret. "Here they are. But we need to go back to 2010, he said, frowning as he adjusted the filters. "This might take a while." Margaret felt the anxiety growing inside her, but she tried to focus. "It's okay. I'll wait," she responded, although her heart was racing. As the old footage appeared, time seemed to drag on. Richard advanced through the months, checking each folder, but the process was slow and tedious. Margaret, who was initially fully attentive, began to feel the fatigue weighing on her. The hours of accumulated tension and sleepless nights finally began to take their toll. Her eyes blinked more slowly, and her head began to nod slightly. "Focus, Margaret. You can't fall asleep now," she muttered to herself, but the constant sound of the clicking mouse and the dim monitor light created a hypnotic rhythm. Without realizing it, Margaret ended up resting her head on the arm of the chair and closing her eyes. Sleep took her unexpectedly, dragging her into a brief moment of oblivion. As she slept, fragments of memories and fears mingled in her dreams. She saw Elizabeth's face, still a child, calling out to her in court, and the image of the burning house like a shadow that never disappeared. Margaret woke with a start, her heart pounding and her gaze confused. "What time is it? Did I miss a lot?" she asked, her voice laden with panic. Richard, who was still sitting next to her, looked at her with a serious expression. "You slept for about an hour," he said calmly, but his next words made Margaret's stomach sink. "Margaret, your sister's execution is scheduled for tomorrow." She felt the ground disappear from under her feet, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. "Tomorrow? But I thought I had more time," she exclaimed, her voice full of anguish. Richard placed his hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her. "We have to keep going. We could still find something, but you need to stay calm," he said firmly. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. The weight of time now seemed unbearable, but she knew she couldn't let herself be discouraged. "All right, let's continue. I can't lose my sister," she said, focusing back on the monitor. Her fingers trembled as she held the mouse, but her determination shone brighter than ever. The clock was running, and every second was a reminder that Elizabeth's fate was in her hands. Margaret squinted her eyes, fixing them on the monitor as the file from the date finally loaded. It was the day of the fire, October 27th, 2010. The video was shaky, the quality not the best, but she couldn't look away. Her heart raced, a mixture of hope and fear. "It's here. It's now," she murmured, leaning closer to the screen. Richard was by her side, but remained silent, understanding the gravity of the moment. At first, the video only showed the front of the houses on the street. The camera was positioned at a fixed angle, capturing Richard's yard and part of the fence separating his property from Margaret's. Everything seemed calm, almost mundane. A car drove by slowly. Children played in the distance and life continued its course. Margaret began to feel a pang of frustration. "There's nothing here," she said, almost in a whisper. Her hands gripped the arms of the chair as she carefully advanced the video. As the time in the video approached the hours when the fire started, Margaret felt her stomach churn. The silence in the room seemed overwhelming, interrupted only by the sound of the mouse clicking. Then something caught her attention. A figure appeared in the corner of the video, near the fence separating the houses. The man seemed casual, as if he was just passing by. He wore a dark jacket and was holding something in his hand. Margaret squinted, trying to distinguish the object. "What is that?" she asked herself, cautiously advancing the video. The mysterious figure stopped near the fence. He looked around as if checking if anyone was watching him. Margaret's heart began to race and she felt a chill run down her spine. The man took something out of his pocket, a cigarette. He lit it, took a few drags, and then threw the lit cigarette onto the ground, right next to the dry leaves accumulated near the wooden fence. Margaret held her breath, watching in shock as the leaves slowly began to catch fire. The man didn't even look back. He just turned and kept walking, disappearing from the camera's frame. "No, it can't be," Margaret repeated, her voice failing as disbelief took over. Her eyes remained fixed on the monitor, watching the flames spread rapidly through the dry leaves, climbing up the side of the house like a hungry predator. With each passing second, the scene seemed more real, more devastating. Margaret felt tears fill her eyes and stream freely down her face. It was an explosive mixture of anger, sadness, and relief. It was him. It wasn't Elizabeth. It was him, she shouted, pointing at the screen with such force that her hands trembled. Richard, by his side, observed in silence, understanding the weight of that moment. He broke the silence with a question that already seemed to have the answer. "Do you recognize this man?" he asked, his voice grave and full of meaning. Margaret nodded slowly, although her mind was in a whirlwind of memories and emotions. "I know this face," she whispered, almost as if she was speaking to herself. The memories began to emerge, like pieces of a puzzle she had never tried to put together before. Andrew, a man who, years ago, was part of her family's life, someone her mother always welcomed with kindness. Andrew, he was there. "He started the fire," she said. Her voice choked with the words she could barely utter. Her chest felt tight, as if the air had been ripped from her lungs. The image of Andrew throwing the cigarette to the ground, with the carelessness of someone who had nothing to lose, burned in her mind like the very fire he had started. Margaret gripped the edge of the table tightly, her fingers digging into the furniture as she tried to contain the whirlwind of emotions. All these years, Elizabeth suffered for something she didn't do, she murmured, her voice laden with pain and anger. He destroyed our lives and walked away, as if nothing had happened. How can someone be so cruel? She asked, more to herself than to Richard, as her head bowed down, her hair falling over her face. Richard placed his hand on Margaret's shoulder, offering the only solace he could in that moment. "You have the proof now. That's what matters," he said, his voice steady but compassionate. "With this you can fight for your sister and finally correct this injustice." Margaret raised her eyes to him, her vision blurred by tears, but filled with determination. "I need to show this. This could save Elizabeth," she said, wiping her face with trembling hands. She knew the clock was ticking against her, but now she had something no one could contest: the truth. The camera kept recording as the fire consumed the side of the house, but Margaret had seen enough. That video wasn't just evidence, it was the thread connecting all the fragments of her shattered life. "He has to pay for this," she muttered, turning off the monitor with a decisive click. Even as the screen darkened, the image of Andrew throwing the cigarette seemed seared into her mind like a scar. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Elizabeth was counting on her, and Margaret had no time to waste. She rose from the chair, her body still trembling with adrenaline. "Richard, I thank you for this. You have no idea what this means to me," she said, turning to him. Richard nodded, his eyes laden with understanding. "Make it count, Margaret. Use this to bring justice," he replied, his voice heavy with the gravity of the moment. Margaret pressed her lips and nodded. "I will. No matter what it takes, I will." As she prepared to leave, her mind was already calculating the next steps. Every fiber of her being was focused on a single goal: to save Elizabeth and ensure Andrew was held accountable for what he had done. For the first time in years, Margaret felt she had something to cling to. It wasn't just hope, it was a weapon, a real chance to change her sister's fate. "I won't let her pay for this." "Not anymore," she promised herself, her voice charged with anger and determination. The night was dark when Margaret left Richard's house, but the darkness didn't intimidate her. She walked with quick strides, her mind buzzing with the next moves. Every breath was a silent promise, every heartbeat a reminder that the truth was finally on her side. The fight wasn't over, but Margaret was more ready than ever to face it. Meanwhile, 18-year-old Elizabeth sat in the small cell, the silence around her almost deafening. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. The weight of what was to come made her chest ache, and her thoughts revolved around all she had lost. The cell door creaked open, and a guard entered, his expression a mix of indifference and discomfort. "It's time for your last meal. What would you like to eat?" he asked, his voice firm but without looking directly at her. Elizabeth slowly raised her eyes, the emptiness in her gaze evident. She thought for a moment, trying to find something that could bring her a little comfort in that somber moment. "Pizza," she said, her voice low but resolute. "I want pizza. It's what my mom always made when we had something to celebrate," she added, feeling nostalgia tighten her chest. The guard nodded and left without saying anything more. When the pizza arrived, Elizabeth was led to a small room where a simple table awaited her. She sat down and looked at the plate before her. The familiar smell brought a wave of memories. Closing her eyes, she could almost hear her mother's voice calling her to the table, could feel Margaret's laughter beside her. "If only you were here," she murmured, as a tear rolled down her face. She took the first bite, trying to savor every piece as if it were a warm embrace from times that would never return. Elizabeth ate slowly, each bite seeming a silent farewell. In her mind, she imagined her mother seated on one side and Margaret on the other, smiling at her as they used to do. "You're here with me," she thought, as if that could ward off the fear that consumed her. But try as she might, reality was relentless. She was alone and the end drew ever nearer. When she finished eating, the guard returned to take her away. "It's time," he said dispassionately as he opened the door. Elizabeth rose, feeling her legs weak, but held her head high. There were no more tears. She had accepted what she believed to be her fate. She was led down a long corridor, each step echoing off the walls like a countdown to the inevitable. As she entered the execution chamber, Elizabeth was enveloped by a silence so heavy it seemed to absorb all the air around her. The room was cold, lit by harsh artificial lights that made everything seem even more oppressive. The walls were bare concrete, without a trace of humanity, and the sterile smell of the place made it clear there was no room for feelings there. Each step she took echoed through the chamber, a cruel reminder that this could be the last sound she heard. There were several people present, uniformed guards, expressionless prison officials, and even a few gawkers, people who had likely never known her but were there to witness the end of her life, as if it were a spectacle. Elizabeth's gaze swept quickly across the room, desperately searching for something, someone to bring her comfort. Her eyes scanned the faces present, but none were familiar. She felt her heart sink as she continued to search. She said she would come, she thought, clinging to that promise as her last hope. But Margaret was not there. The emptiness in her chest grew. With every passing second, her sister did not appear. The feeling of abandonment hit her like a cold wave, and the loneliness of that moment nearly made her collapse. Elizabeth lowered her eyes, fighting to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. The lump in her throat was almost unbearable, but she did not want to give anyone there the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "Not even my sister is here to say goodbye," she whispered to herself, her voice cracked, almost inaudible. The idea of facing this moment without Margaret by her side was more painful than the fate that awaited her. Memories began flooding her mind, Margaret holding her hand when they were little, promising she would always take care of her. "You always took care of me. And now?" she thought, feeling the weight of disappointment. Suddenly, the oppressive silence was broken by the sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor. Elizabeth raised her head with a start, her heart beating faster. The footsteps approached, echoing louder and louder until the door burst open. Elizabeth turned her head and saw Margaret entering the room, breathless and her face marked with concern. She seemed to have run the entire way, and her hands trembled slightly as she held the door. "Please let me speak with her." "Just for a moment," Margaret pleaded, her voice laden with urgency and emotion. The guards exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. This wasn't part of the protocol, but there was something in Margaret's voice, in the intensity of her gaze, that made them hesitate. The supervisor, an older man with a serious expression, assessed the situation for a moment before nodding. "So you have 5 minutes," he said, his tone firm but understanding. Margaret wasted no time. She ran to Elizabeth, ignoring the looks around her, as if only the two of them existed in that moment. Elizabeth remained motionless as she watched Margaret approach, almost as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time not of sadness, but of a relief she didn't even know was possible. When Margaret finally reached her sister, she held her hands tightly, as if to ensure that Elizabeth wouldn't disappear. "Elizabeth, I'm here," Margaret said, her voice broken but full of determination. Her eyes, red from crying, met Elizabeth's, which now shone with a mixture of shock and relief. "You came," Elizabeth whispered, her voice almost inaudible but laden with emotion. Her expression seemed disbelieving, as if Margaret's mere presence was something impossible at that moment. Tears finally escaped her eyes as she felt the warmth of her sister's hands. Margaret squeezed her hands even tighter, leaning closer. "Of course I came. I would never give up on you," she said, her voice firm but trembling. Her tone was an unwavering promise, something only the two of them could understand. In that brief moment, the world around them disappeared. There were no guards, onlookers, or even the electric chair itself. There were only Elizabeth and Margaret, united by a bond that time and injustice had never managed to break. Elizabeth felt a renewed strength within herself, something she hadn't experienced in years. She wasn't alone, and that was all that mattered in that moment. No matter how inevitable her fate seemed, Margaret's presence made her feel seen, protected, loved. Margaret continued to hold Elizabeth's hands, as if she wanted to convey all the strength she had accumulated over the past years. She knew the words had to be few but powerful. There was no time for hesitation or regrets. Every second counted, and she needed to make Elizabeth believe there was still hope. "I would never let you face this alone," Margaret said, her voice choked but full of truth. And for the first time in a long while, Elizabeth believed. Elizabeth was led to the reserved room, where the light was cold and the silence even heavier than in the corridor. The door closed behind her, and for a few seconds she was alone, looking at the simple table and chairs that seemed too large for that cramped space. Soon the door opened again and Margaret entered, her face marked by the concern and urgency of the moment. Neither of them said anything immediately. It was as if the weight of what was to come had stolen their words. They sat facing each other, Margaret's gaze fixed on Elizabeth's. Time seemed frozen in that room. Despite being separated only by the table, the emotional distance between what they felt and what needed to be said seemed immeasurable. Elizabeth held her sister's hands tightly, as if she wanted to engrave that touch forever. The guards outside waited, ensuring their privacy, but also limiting the time they had. Their mouths moved, but what was said in that room remained a mystery to everyone outside. Unspoken words were exchanged, tears flowed, and something shifted between them. When the minutes ended, the door opened again, and the guards led Elizabeth back to the corridor. Margaret left shortly after, but now with a different expression. She returned to the area reserved for observers, where other people awaited the execution, and sat in silence. The weight of the moment kept her motionless, but her mind was racing. In the execution room, Elizabeth was placed in the electric chair. The ensuing silence was oppressive as the technicians adjusted the cables and tightened the straps. The harsh white light from the projectors cast shadows on the walls, further heightening the tension in the room. The attendees, including police officers, guards, and a few curious onlookers, were attentive to every movement. Margaret, seated in the observers' area, could barely breathe. She watched every detail, but her eyes were fixed on Elizabeth, searching for any sign of strength or despair in her sister. Judge Andrew was present, leaning against one of the side walls. His expression was cold, almost indifferent, as if this were just another case closed for him. He observed the scene with the demeanor of someone who was certain justice was being served. Margaret, however, could barely contain her indignation at seeing him there, so detached from any guilt or responsibility. Her clenched fists in her lap were the only visible indication of the seething rage within her. When all preparations were completed, the supervisor walked towards the chair, his steps echoing through the cold floor of the execution chamber. He stopped beside Elizabeth, adjusting his glasses and clearing his throat before speaking. "You have a right to your last words," he announced, his voice firm but devoid of emotion, as if it were just another formality in that night's protocol. The sound of his voice seemed to freeze time in the room. The white lights from the projectors cast rigid shadows on the walls, and the tension was so thick it felt almost palpable. The spectators barely breathed, waiting to hear what Elizabeth would say, as the utter silence made every sound more evident. Elizabeth remained silent for a few seconds, as if carefully pondering what to say. Her head was bowed, but when she raised it, her eyes shone with a determination no one expected. Slowly she scanned the room with her gaze, ignoring the unfamiliar faces, until her eyes met Margaret's. Seated at the back, Margaret seemed small amidst the crowd, but her gaze conveyed strength, hope, and something Elizabeth desperately needed at that moment: support. The two looked at each other for a few seconds, and in that instant the world around seemed to have disappeared. There were no more guards, police officers, or even the electric chair. There were only Elizabeth and Margaret, and between them an invisible and unbreakable bond. Elizabeth's gaze left Margaret and fixed on Judge Andrew, who observed the scene with the same cold and distant expression as always. His composure was almost unsettling, but Elizabeth knew there was more behind that impassive face. Taking a deep breath, she finally broke the silence, her voice cutting through the environment like a sharp blade. "It wasn't me who killed my mother," she began, each word charged with a clarity that made everyone in the room hold their breath. Her voice didn't tremble, despite the weight of the statement, and her words echoed off the concrete walls. A murmur began to grow among those present. Guards and spectators exchanged confused looks, unable to ignore the impact of what they had just heard. Elizabeth, however, was not shaken by the commotion around her. Her voice remained steady, her posture upright as she continued. "It was you, Andrew. You were the one who killed my mother," she accused, her words resonating in the room like thunder amid the tense silence. The impact of her accusation seemed almost physical, leaving everyone frozen for an instant. The room exploded into murmurs and whispers, a chaos that contrasted with the utter silence from seconds before. Some leaned forward, trying to confirm what they had just heard. Others looked directly at Andrew, whose expression was starting to show cracks. The judge, who until then had maintained an immaculate demeanor, straightened himself against the wall he was leaning on, his body tense as his eyes narrowed toward Elizabeth. The coldness in his expression was now replaced by something closer to discomfort. "This girl is desperate," he muttered, trying to regain control of the situation, but his voice sounded less firm, almost hesitant. Elizabeth, still strapped to the chair, didn't look away. Her eyes were fixed on the judge with an intensity that seemed to pierce through him. The crowd continued to murmur, but for Elizabeth, there was no one else there. Her accusation hung in the air like a shadow, carrying the weight of years of pain and injustice. The air in the room felt heavier, almost suffocating, as the tension continued to build. Every second that passed was like an eternity, and no one dared interrupt the moment. Elizabeth's accusation was not just a statement. It was a spark that threatened to ignite the entire structure of truth that many there believed to be unshakable. Margaret remained seated, but her fists were clenched and her heart seemed to beat so loudly that she believed everyone in the room could hear it. Elizabeth's accusation echoed in the environment, and the murmurs grew in intensity. Judge Andrew, who until then had maintained a cold and controlled demeanor, seemed flustered. He shook his head, trying to remain calm, but the slight tremor in his hands did not go unnoticed by Margaret. It was time to act. She took a deep breath and stood up, determination shining in her eyes. "I have the evidence," Margaret declared, her voice loud and clear, interrupting the chaos that was beginning to form in the room. All eyes turned to her, including the judges, who now seemed genuinely concerned. Margaret took a step forward, holding the device in her hand. "This tape shows exactly what happened on the day of the fire. It shows who really caused my mother's death and destroyed our lives," she said, with a firmness that cut through the air. The execution supervisor looked at her, hesitant, but something in Margaret's conviction made him signal for the execution to be paused. The guards around Elizabeth began to release the straps, while one of the technicians adjusted the projector. "If what you say is true, show it," said the supervisor, his voice laden with skepticism but also curiosity. Margaret handed the device to him, and the room fell into complete silence as the tape began to roll. The images were clear despite the time that had passed. The recording showed the backyard of a house, the same one Margaret had watched the night before. The spectators watched in silence, leaning forward, as if they wanted to capture every detail. Then Andrew's figure appeared, casually walking toward the fence with a cigarette in hand. He took a few drags before carelessly throwing it to the ground, close to the dry leaves. The fire started small but quickly spread, reaching the side of the house and growing in intensity. A murmur of shock began to grow in the room. Some people put their hands over their mouths, while others exchanged incredulous looks. "My God," whispered one of the spectators, her voice full of horror. But Margaret didn't stop there. She took a step forward, her voice trembling with emotion as she pointed at the judge. "And you knew about it, Andrew? You knew who the real culprit was from the beginning, but you chose to hide the truth. To protect your reputation, you forged the evidence against my sister, condemning her for something she didn't do." The judge opened his mouth to protest, but Margaret continued, her voice now laden with anger and sadness. "You were in love with my mother, Sylvia. All these years, you hid your obsession, but I found out. The letters you wrote to her, the unrequited promises of love. When she rejected you, when she chose another life, you decided that no one would have what you couldn't have. That's why you threw that cigarette. That's why you started the fire. You wanted to destroy everything, out of pure rage and revenge." The room erupted in murmurs again, like an uncontrollable wave, rippling through everyone present. Margaret's revelations seemed impossible to process, and the air grew heavy with tension. People whispered to each other, some disbelieving, others clearly shocked. Andrew, who until then had maintained a cold and controlled facade, now visibly shaken. The judge, so accustomed to being in command, seemed to lose his composure with every passing second. He took a step forward, his face contorted with rage, and pointed at Margaret, his voice trembling with fury. "That's a lie. You have no idea what you're talking about," he shouted, but his protest sounded desperate, almost like a last resort of someone who knew their mask had fallen. The usual confidence Andrew displayed seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind a vulnerable man, cornered by the truths Margaret had unearthed. His words ricocheted around the room, but no one seemed convinced. The background murmur intensified, and the looks of scorn and doubt directed at him increased. Andrew's face turned red with rage, a fury so intense it seemed to spill out with every movement. He strode towards the electric chair's control panel with quick steps, ignoring the shouts of protest around him. "Enough! This has gone too far," he bellowed as he stretched his hands towards the buttons, his gaze fixed on the equipment as if it were his last chance to regain some control. Margaret took an instinctive step forward, her heart racing. But before she could shout, Andrew slammed the buttons down hard. The panel lit up, and a spark jumped from the system, briefly illuminating Andrew's twisted face. People in the room recoiled, some letting out gasps of surprise. The tension reached its peak, but before anything could happen, one of the technicians acted quickly, disconnecting the main power source. The equipment powered down with an audible click, and the silence that followed was broken only by the sound of everyone's ragged breaths. Two guards moved quickly, grabbing Andrew by his arms as he struggled, shouting incoherent words in his fury. "You don't understand. Everything I did was for her. She rejected me, and they took everything from me," he roared, his voice growing louder and more uncontrolled. The room watched in shock, witnessing the collapse of a man who until that moment had seemed untouchable. Andrew, restrained by the guards, thrashed as if trying to fight against the inevitable. Elizabeth, still strapped to the electric chair, watched it all with a mixture of relief and shock. Her breathing was heavy, but her eyes, once filled with resignation, now shone with new hope. She looked at Margaret, who was standing in the center of the room, panting but steadfast. Her sister's presence seemed to anchor her to reality, even amidst the chaos around her. Elizabeth felt a wave of gratitude flood her chest. For the first time in years, it seemed that destiny might change in her favor. Margaret, her chest rising and falling as she tried to catch her breath, looked at Andrew being restrained. She took a step forward, her expression laden with anger and relief. Her voice, when it finally sounded, was firm and unwavering, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "You tried to destroy my family, but we're still here. And the truth has finally come to light," she declared, her words echoing through the room. Everyone present, from the guards to the spectators, remained silent, taking in what they had just witnessed. The initial chaos gave way to a solemn tension as people began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Andrew, once an unquestionable figure of authority, was now just a broken man, exposed before them all. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on him, as if she wanted to ensure he felt the weight of every word she had uttered. Elizabeth, still seated in the chair, raised her head with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. The room, once dominated by despair, was now permeated by something different, the promise of justice. The room was steeped in a heavy silence, broken only by muffled murmurs and the sound of the guards' footsteps as they held Judge Andrew. The man who until then had carried an imposing and unwavering demeanor now seemed to shrink with every movement, his face flushed and his gaze fixed on the floor. The mask of indifference and authority had fallen completely, revealing a defeated man, exposed before all for his lies and cruelty. Those present, who had previously watched the execution with the detachment of distant spectators, now leaned towards each other, whispering words of disapproval and disbelief. The weight of Margaret's accusations and the evidence displayed changed the tone of the room, transforming indignation into something more palpable, the beginning of justice. "Stand up, Andrew," ordered one of the guards, holding him firmly by the arm. Andrew hesitated, resisting with minimal force, but his faltering stance showed that he knew there was no more escape. Each step he took seemed like a blow to his reputation, and the onlookers' glances of disdain followed him like a shadow. Margaret remained standing, her gaze fixed on the judge as he was led out of the room. Her fists were clenched, and the relief of finally exposing the truth mingled with the anger that still burned within her. Elizabeth, still seated in the electric chair, watched the scene in silence, her body rigid as she tried to process what had just happened. The murmurs in the room grew louder as Andrew was escorted out, his cries of protest cutting through the air, but without the force they once carried. "You don't understand," he shouted, trying to break free from the guards. "This is a mistake. Everything I did was for her. You're destroying my life over a lie." Andrew's voice sounded less like a defense and more like a desperate lament, unable to face the truths that were now exposed. The guards held him tighter as he thrashed, but no one in the room seemed willing to listen to his words. The execution supervisor, who had watched everything in silence until then, raised his hand to calm those present. "The execution is officially suspended," he announced, his voice firm, cutting through the murmurs. He turned to the technicians around the electric chair. "Release the prisoner immediately. This case will be reviewed in court based on the new evidence." His words brought a wave of relief that seemed to sweep through the entire room, though some people still looked in shock at the spot where Andrew had been. Elizabeth lowered her head, allowing her tears to flow freely. It wasn't just the relief of escaping imminent death, but the release of years of pain and injustice. The technicians began to undo the straps that bound Elizabeth, working quickly as the guards watched over them. Margaret ran to her sister as soon as the last straps were removed, enveloping her in a tight embrace. For a moment, they remained silent, clinging to each other as if the weight of the past years was finally being shared and somehow alleviated. Elizabeth cupped Margaret's face with her hands, her eyes filled with gratitude and emotion. "You did this for me," she whispered, her voice choked. Margaret shook her head, gripping Elizabeth's hands tightly. "I would always do this for you," she replied, her voice laden with love and determination. Outside the execution room, Andrew was led to a police vehicle that was already waiting for him. The crowd that had gathered around the building watched in silence as he was placed in the car. His expression, once full of arrogance and control, was now one of pure shame. The judge who once commanded the fates of so many with a firm hand was now at the mercy of the very system he had manipulated for years. The irony of the situation did not go unnoticed by those present, who murmured among themselves, expressing indignation and relief at the downfall of such a powerful man. Days later, in a crowded courtroom, Elizabeth's case was reopened. Margaret was by her sister's side, sitting in the front row, her hands tightly clasped, as if to convey strength with every second. The tension in the room was palpable, but this time there was something different: hope. The new judge presiding over the case carefully reviewed the evidence presented by Margaret. The video footage, showing Andrew throwing the cigarette and starting the fire, was displayed before everyone, and the impact was immediate. Reactions ranged from shock to outrage, as experts confirmed that the evidence used in the original trial had clearly been tampered with. The courtroom was in absolute silence as the new judge delivered the final verdict. He looked directly at Elizabeth, who now appeared stronger, more resolute, despite everything she had endured. After reviewing the new evidence, "This court declares Elizabeth innocent of the charges against her," he announced, his voice echoing through the hall. The words were met with an outburst of relief and muted applause. Elizabeth brought her hands to her face, letting the tears flow freely as Margaret embraced her tightly. It was as if finally the weight of years of pain and guilt was being lifted from her shoulders. As the courtroom dispersed, Margaret and Elizabeth stepped out onto the entrance steps, where the sunlight seemed brighter than ever before. The two paused for a moment, looking up at the sky before turning to face each other. "We made it," said Elizabeth, her voice still trembling but filled with hope. Margaret smiled, holding her sister's hand. "It wasn't easy, but we made it," she replied, a tone of pride reflecting the effort they had put in to get there. Meanwhile, in another courtroom, Andrew awaited trial for the crimes he had committed. Charges of evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and attempted homicide weighed against him, and his former position of power would not be enough to protect him this time. The downfall of the judge who had caused so much suffering was inevitable, and justice finally seemed to be reaching those who truly deserved it. Margaret and Elizabeth's future was still uncertain, but now they had something that had been denied them for so long, the freedom to start over. The path there had been painful and full of obstacles, but the two knew that together they could overcome anything. The past would still leave scars, but the hope of a brighter future guided them as they descended the courthouse steps, ready to begin again. After the turmoil of the courtroom and the relief of victory, Margaret and Elizabeth left the building hand in hand, feeling the sun warm their faces for the first time in a long while. It was an ordinary day for many, but for them it was the start of a new life. The sky seemed bluer, the air lighter. Elizabeth, who had spent years suffocated by pain and injustice, looked at her sister with a smile that mixed gratitude and relief. "We made it, Margaret. You made it," she said, her voice still trembling but laden with emotion. Margaret squeezed her sister's hand tightly, her gaze full of determination. "We made it, Elizabeth. I could never have left you alone," she replied, with a tone that reflected the weight of everything they had endured. But in that moment, they knew the past would no longer define them. They had a chance to start over, to create something new, and they were determined to seize that opportunity. In the days that followed, the sisters spent time together, away from all the chaos. Margaret made sure to take Elizabeth to a peaceful place, a small country house that had been lent by a close friend. It was simple but cozy, surrounded by trees and a garden where the wind swayed the flowers. Elizabeth, accustomed to the cold walls of the orphanage and prison, was enchanted by the freedom of that place. "It's so beautiful here, Margaret. It feels like I'm dreaming," she said, as she walked barefoot across the grass. "So you deserve all this and more, Elizabeth. Now is your chance to be happy," Margaret responded, watching her sister explore the place with the enthusiasm of a child rediscovering the world. For Margaret, seeing Elizabeth smile again was the greatest reward for all the struggle. She knew the path to recovery would be long, but she was willing to stand by her sister every step of the way. Over time, the two began to rebuild their lives. Margaret, who had left her job to dedicate herself fully to Elizabeth's case, found work at a local NGO that helped young people in vulnerable situations. For her, that work was more than just an occupation. It was a way to transform the pain of the past into something meaningful. Elizabeth, in turn, devoted herself to learning new skills. With Margaret's help, she began attending art classes at a nearby school. Whenever she picked up a pencil or brush, it felt as if the weight of the past dissolved a little more. One morning, while painting in the garden, Elizabeth turned to Margaret, who was sitting in a nearby chair, reading a book. "Margaret, do you think I'll ever be able to forget everything that happened?" she asked, her voice laden with uncertainty. Margaret closed the book and looked at her sister with an understanding smile. "Forget? Perhaps not. But you will learn to live beyond it, to find happiness despite what happened. The past will always be a part of who we are, but it doesn't have to define our future," she replied, her voice full of wisdom. Margaret's words stuck with Elizabeth, who began to focus more and more on building something new for herself. She discovered a special talent for painting and, encouraged by her sister, began selling some of her works at local fairs. People were drawn to the emotion Elizabeth put into each piece, and she began to gain confidence. "Margaret, I never thought anyone could like what I do," she said one day as she delivered a painting to a customer. "People don't just like what you do, Elizabeth. They like you," Margaret replied with a proud smile. Over time, the sisters decided to expand their life together. Margaret used part of the donations they had received after their story gained national attention to buy a small studio downtown. The space was transformed into a place to work and socialize, where Elizabeth could paint and Margaret could organize events to help young people who were also facing difficulties. The studio soon became a vibrant gathering place, filled with art, music, and stories of overcoming adversity. During one of those events, while Elizabeth was helping a young woman create her first drawing, Margaret watched her from afar, with tears in her eyes. It was hard to believe that the same girl who once faced a death sentence was now there, inspiring others to believe in themselves. "You really found your strength, Elizabeth," Margaret thought, feeling a wave of pride. One day, while cleaning the studio after an exhibition, Elizabeth suddenly stopped and looked at Margaret. "Have you ever thought about how different all of this would have been if you hadn't fought for me?" she asked, her voice low but full of meaning. Margaret paused for a moment, setting the broom aside, and approached her sister. "I would never have left you alone, Elizabeth, no matter how difficult it was. You're my family, my sister, and you were always worth every effort," she replied, holding Elizabeth's hands firmly. The lives of the two continued to flourish, but the impact of their story went far beyond them. News about the injustice Elizabeth faced and Margaret's courage in exposing the truth inspired people across the country. They received invitations to speak at schools, organizations, and events, sharing their story of resilience and love. Margaret, who had always been discreet, was initially hesitant, but Elizabeth convinced her that this was an opportunity to make a difference. "If our story can help someone, then it's worth sharing," she said with a smile that reflected her newfound confidence. With each passing day, the sisters grew closer to a full and happy life. Every moment they shared was an opportunity to rebuild the bonds that the past had tried to break. They learned that healing was not a final destination, but a constant and nuanced process. Small gestures like a peaceful breakfast, a spontaneous laugh, or an evening conversation became essential parts of their journey. They discovered that even in hardship there was beauty, and that together they could overcome any obstacle. The strength they found in each other was like an anchor, keeping them steady even in the face of uncertainty. On a quiet afternoon, as they sat in the garden of the studio they had built with so much effort, Elizabeth looked up at the sky. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the horizon with shades of orange and pink that seemed like a living painting. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the flowers Margaret had planted, and let out a sigh of relief. "I never thought I could be happy again, Margaret," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Her eyes shone with an emotion that only those who have faced darkness and found light could understand. Margaret, sitting beside her, put her arm around her sister, offering a silent comfort that came naturally. She looked at Elizabeth, seeing in her the strength she had always known existed, even in the darkest moments. "You deserve all the happiness in the world, Elizabeth, and this is just the beginning," she replied with a sincere smile. That moment, simple yet powerful, encapsulated everything they had achieved together. It was a reminder that mutual love and support could transform even the deepest wounds. Over the years, Margaret and Elizabeth continued to expand their studio and their lives in ways they had never imagined. They began receiving invitations to exhibit Elizabeth's work in local art galleries, and each show was a celebration of resilience and talent. Margaret, in turn, used the studio as a space to welcome vulnerable young people, offering art workshops and talks on overcoming challenges. Together, they transformed the space into a beacon of hope for the community, a place where difficult stories could find a happier ending. Elizabeth also began to explore the world beyond the studio. Encouraged by Margaret, she participated in national and international art competitions, gaining recognition for her work that conveyed emotion and vulnerability in a unique way. Each achievement was shared with Margaret, who was always there, applauding louder than everyone else. "You're conquering the world, Elizabeth," she would say with pride, holding her sister's hands after each new victory. And Elizabeth would always respond with a smile, "Not without you by my side." The two also decided to travel together, exploring places they had only seen in books or imagined in dreams. On one of those trips, as they walked through the streets of Paris, Elizabeth stopped in front of a bridge covered in locks, where couples left symbols of eternal love. She looked at Margaret and smiled. "I think we should leave a lock here. We're not a couple, but we're the greatest team I've ever known," she said, her eyes shining. Margaret laughed and agreed, and the two left a lock inscribed with "Elizabeth and Margaret, united for life." That moment became a precious memory, a symbol of the unbreakable bond between them. The scars of the past remained, but now they wore them as medals, symbols of strength and resilience. What was once a source of pain had become a reminder that they were capable of facing anything together. They learned to share their experiences with others, inspiring those who needed to hear that, even in the most difficult circumstances, there was a chance to start over. Margaret and Elizabeth began to be invited to speak at schools, community events and organizations, telling their story with authenticity and emotion. "The pain we lived through can be transformed into something meaningful," Margaret would say in her speeches, always looking at Elizabeth with pride. In the moments of silence, when the spotlights dimmed and they returned home, the sisters allowed themselves to reflect on how far they had come. On one such night, as they rested on the sofa in their shared home, Elizabeth looked at Margaret with a serious but loving expression. "You have sacrificed so much for me, Margaret. I don't know how I can ever thank you enough for never giving up on me," she said, holding her sister's hand. Margaret smiled, shaking her head. "You don't need to thank me, Elizabeth. I did what any sister would do. And you have given me more than you can imagine, a reason to fight, a reason to believe that the world can be a better place." Their story wasn't just about injustice and suffering, but about the human capacity to love, forgive, and start anew. They learned that the past, no matter how painful, didn't have to define the future. The studio they built became not just a space for art, but a home where dreams were nurtured and lives transformed. Young people facing challenges found not only a place to express their creativity, but also an unconditional support that many had never known. If Margaret and Elizabeth's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and check out the story appearing on screen now, specially selected for you. See you soon.